CPU. The rule for CPUs is simple. The more modern, the better. You can understand this most easily by looking at the processor's release date. A more modern processor generally offers higher performance with lower power consumption. The next thing to look at is the core count. For today, I recommend aiming for a minimum of 4 cores, and if possible, 6 cores or more. You can think of this as a sort of segmentation. Motherboard. Go for well-known brands as much as possible for the motherboard. Asus, ASRock, MSI, and Gigabyte are brands you can trust in this regard. The most important reason for this is that they offer BIOS updates regularly and reliably. These updates can increase performance, expand hardware support, and solve existing problems. You need to stay further away from no-name brands or brands that don't manage the BIOS well. Another important point is that the motherboard has enough slots and ports. Details like RAM slots, M2 SSD, SATA, and USB ports are critical here. This number is directly related to how modern your current build is. For example, old motherboards don't have M2 support. Although these may seem unimportant at first, they can severely restrict you when the time comes. So it's useful to pay attention to this when buying. If you're going to build a PC from scratch with a very low budget, target LGA 1700 or AM4 platforms as much as possible. Choose the LGA 1200 only as a last resort, as anything below this enters the mega budget level. To avoid confusing you, I'll talk about all compatibility issues later in the video. Graphics card. When it comes to the GPU, we have to accept that it all comes down to price. That's why it's unfortunately very easy to render what I say here useless. On the NVIDIA side, the current series is RTX 5000. If you're going to game, try not to go below the GTX 1000 and GTX 1600 series. If you have a very tight budget, the most logical point in terms of price performance is still the RTX 2000 series. On the AMD side, the naming scheme is unfortunately quite complex. The lowest level you should go for is the RX 588GB. If you're able to get a good deal, the RX 6000 series is still considered powerful and recent enough. However, the RX 5000 series is a bit problematic due to some chronic issues, so you definitely need to do good research before buying. Intel GPUs are generally modern but weak on the efficiency side. We can encounter problems like software issues, high temperatures, and high power consumption. The best example of this is the ARC A750. In the newer ARC B580 models, most of these problems have mostly been resolved. Another critical topic in GPU selection is VRAM. On a low budget, you need to go for at least 6 GB. If you can go up to 8 GB, prioritize that. Anything above 8 GB is something that needs to be evaluated based on the card's price and the GPU's power. Another topic is AIB brands. These brands modify GPUs with different cooling solutions and offer them for sale. Model quality can vary seriously depending on the series and the GPU used. I won't go into detail here as there are specific videos about this on the channel. You can get detailed info there if you're curious. Generally, I recommend avoiding no-name brands. You can trust the brands I'm showing on the screen right now. Storage. Nowadays, hard disks should only be chosen for data storage purposes. You don't even want to know how sluggish they make the operating system. SATA or M2 SSDs have become the standard now. If you're dealing with very old PCs, prioritize SATA SSDs. Even if your budget is very limited, try to find a 120 GB SATA SSD. You'll thank me after installing Windows on it. Modern games really take up too much space. That's why you should have at least 500 GB, preferably 1 TB of storage space. If you have nothing to do with games, and you mostly do light usage, even 250 GB of storage might be enough for you. So this part depends entirely on your personal usage. RAM. If the computer you own has 4 GB of RAM, I can safely say that it's mandatory to go up to 8 GB. 16 GB is the best amount for most users, and where the difference is felt the most. I'd say anything above that is unnecessary for most users, especially considering current RAM prices. CPU cooler. If the processor you're using has heating issues, you should get rid of the stock fan and switch to a better cooler, because when the CPU gets hot, it throttles its performance to protect itself and tries to cool down that way. However, some processors still work just fine with the stock fan. Most CPU coolers that are better than the stock fan will be more than enough for daily use and gaming. PSU. Since the PSU is the part that provides power to the PC, stay away from old and worn-out products. You should lean towards current models from known brands. The wattage here changes based on the build's power needs. If you want to invest a bit in the future, I recommend buying a high-quality PSU of at least 550 watts. If your budget allows you to go up to 750 watts, that would be even better for you. So which of these parts should you prioritize when upgrading? Here, the PC you have is the #1 factor. Assuming you have a PC that's weak in every aspect, I prepared this roadmap you'll see on the screen. If one of the stages here is already at a sufficient level, you can skip it. However, before that, you need to know the things that might prevent you from making these upgrades. The biggest criterion in compatibility and the skeleton of the build is the motherboard. This is the part that directly determines how modern a build you can set up and how many extra parts you can plug into the PC. The first thing you need to pay attention to is the socket, as the CPU and motherboard must have the same one. For example, if you choose a motherboard with an old socket like LGA1151, you are limited only to processors belonging to that socket. If you're going to use platforms that have been on the market for a long time, like AM4 or LGA1700, you often need to do a BIOS update. Thanks to this update, you can run CPUs released later on that motherboard without issues, as long as they have the same socket. The DDR4 and DDR5 distinction works with the same logic. A DDR4 RAM can only be used with a DDR4 motherboard, and a DDR5 RAM can only be used with a DDR5 motherboard. Another important topic is the number of ports and slots. Not having enough SATA and M2 slots creates a serious obstacle when you want to increase your storage in the future. The number of RAM slots can restrict you in the same way. Form factor refers to the physical size of the motherboard. If your case doesn't support your motherboard's form factor, you can't physically install that motherboard. In laptops, the situation is a bit more limited. Some models may have extra RAM and SSD slots, while others have none. Never forget that laptops always have more limited upgrade options. Another part is the PSU. The PSU needs to stably provide the wattage value the PC needs. This is essential for both the healthy operation of the PC and for your peace of mind. After that, what you need to look at are the cables coming out of the PSU. Especially if you want to modernize your build, you might be seriously restricted due to missing or insufficient power cables. Next is the wattage calculation. You should calculate the maximum power consumption of the parts in the build and choose a PSU by definitely adding a tolerance margin on top. For example, if your build draws 340 watts under the heaviest load, then at least a 400-watt PSU is required. However, if the price difference isn't much, it would be more logical for you to get a PSU of 550 watts and above. This both sets the ground for any upgrade plans you might make in the future and prevents the PSU from constantly working under full load. Another part is RAM. I previously mentioned that only DDR4 RAMs can be installed on DDR4 motherboards. Aside from this, RAMs used in laptops and RAMs used in desktop PCs are different from each other. That's where finding compatible RAM comes into play. If you install memory very different from the specs of the existing RAM in the build, you may experience incompatibility issues. So either choose memory of the same brand and model, or choose RAMs with technical specs very close to each other. This one's a bit of a detailed topic, but I need to briefly mention it. While using 4 channels or sticks of RAM on the DDR4 side is relatively problem-free, I recommend staying away from this as much as possible on DDR5. In DDR5, as the number of channels increases, stability can deteriorate seriously, and you might need to significantly lower RAM speeds to keep the build stable. Storage is a bit of a weirder topic. Some old laptops have a CD-ROM drive. By removing this part, a SATA SSD or a 2.5-inch HDD can be installed in its place. If you want to bring your laptop back to life, installing a SATA SSD here is mandatory. In desktop PCs, the point to pay attention to most is the M.2 slot. Some motherboards have only a single M.2 slot. If you want to increase storage space in the future, you may need to use SATA SSDs, HDDs, or converter solutions. In summary, if you are going to update your current PC hardware-wise, you absolutely need to take these into consideration. But the job doesn't end here. Treating your PC well is just as important as the hardware. So let's talk a bit about this now. Maintenance and organization. If you don't care about your PC, it won't care about you either, and it won't perform as well as it possibly could. Therefore, regardless of your computer's age, you must perform maintenance on it at certain intervals. Stage 1. Thermal maintenance. Thermal paste, thermal pads, and dust cleaning directly affect cooling performance. This means getting rid of performance drops caused by heat. This topic is much more important in laptops. In desktop PCs, thermal paste and thermal pads can be changed every 2 to 3 years. For dust cleaning, a light cleaning every 3 months and a detailed cleaning 1 to 2 times a year is sufficient. In laptops, I recommend dust maintenance twice a year depending on the model. Thermal paste and pads should be changed every 1 to 2 years, again, depending on the model. However, if there are serious temperature problems, these operations can also be done more frequently. Another topic frequently skipped in desktop PCs is airflow and cable management. Messy cables prevent air from circulating freely inside the case. Airflow is about adjusting the blowing directions of the fans correctly. Hot air must be evacuated from the case without creating turbulence. Just paying attention to these two issues can drop the temperatures by up to 10 degrees in some cases. Stage 2. Cleaning up after the operating system. You need to clean up junk files accumulated over the years, application leftovers, and similar unnecessary data 1 to 2 times a year. This topic is a separate video subject in itself, but you're lucky because there is a detailed video on the channel exactly about this. I don't want to extend the topic and go into too much detail here. If it interests you, I recommend you watch that video. Stage 3. Where you place the PC. This is perhaps the weirdest, but also the most ignored stage. Try not to put your desktop PC in a narrow and enclosed space. This leads to dust accumulating faster, heat not being expelled from the case, and temperatures generally rising. As a result, the time between thermal maintenance shortens and performance drops faster. In laptops, specifically avoid soft surfaces. If the fans can't pull enough air, the cooling system, which is already very limited, becomes completely dysfunctional. If possible, keep the laptop a few centimeters above the ground. You can use laptop stands or cooler pads for this. This way, you won't block the airflow and will preserve cooling performance. So is that all? Unfortunately, no. No matter how powerful or weak your hardware is, you need to support your hardware with proper usage on the software side. This brings us to our last main topic, software and usage style. What you'll do here is either very cheap or completely free. Also, these are the real things keeping aging PCs alive without messing with its internals. Operating system choice. We often forget what a problematic and resource-wasteful piece of software Windows is. That's why the choice you make here can really create a big difference in terms of performance. If you have a very old computer, even using Windows 7 instead of Windows 10 can create a noticeable difference. Its RAM requirements are lower and it's lighter in general. Yes, there are program compatibility issues, but if you lack hardware power and don't want lag, you might have to make this trade-off. Alternative Windows versions might also work for you. For example, Windows 10 LTSC is a simpler and more stable version where unnecessary apps are not present. It offers only the core operating system and receives security updates. This way, it consumes fewer hardware resources. However, remember that it might cause compatibility issues in some programs and games. If you are really stubborn about getting maximum efficiency from an aging PC, you can switch to Linux. Let me say it from the start, it's not for everyone. Its interface might be harder compared to Windows. You usually need to find solutions to problems by researching, and program compatibility is more selective, especially if you like playing games with anti-cheat software. Moreover, you need to choose the Linux distribution that suits you best, which can be puzzling for newcomers. However, in return for all these efforts, you gain a lot. Freedom in the operating system, absence of anything you don't need, more efficient use of hardware power, much rarer viruses, strong community support, and serious advantages in some lines of work, like development. Free performance boosters. Turning on XMP or Expo, deleting unnecessary apps, and changing the power plan are steps that do no harm and are must-dos. Since I touched on these topics in detail in the video I mentioned just a moment ago, I don't want to repeat myself here. Don't forget to watch it after this video. Driver update. Components like the motherboard and graphics card have drivers. Keeping these up to date can solve some problems in the build and directly gain you performance. So don't neglect updates. However, you must definitely do this process through the brand's own official site. Automatic driver downloader programs might install the wrong driver or infect the PC with a virus, so stay away from them. Review game settings. When trying to bring your PC back to life, the last thing you should care about is graphics. That's why lowering settings is often the most logical solution. However, on an average PC, if you want to get the best image with the highest FPS, things get a bit complicated. You might get drowned among settings like tessellation, ambient occlusion, and anti-aliasing, and experience serious FPS loss due to a wrong choice. I have a special guide on the channel for this topic. If you want to intervene knowing what the settings do, I definitely recommend you watch that video. Lossless scaling, Magpie, and integer scaler. These programs run the game at a lower resolution and scale the image afterward, reducing the load on the GPU. In return, you experience some image quality loss, but you can get a smoother gaming experience. If you normally get above 30 FPS and set these programs up correctly, they can manage you for a while longer. I can say it's a quite useful method, especially for those who lower settings to the minimum to get FPS on bad PCs. Finally, overclock. Why am I saying this when there is an entire video on the channel with the message, don't overclock? Because old processors can actually get incredible boosts from overclocking. In those times, manufacturers left much wider tolerances, and it was possible to increase frequencies by over 35%. Nowadays, CPUs come off the production line almost squeezed dry. Not much tolerance is left, and often it's not worth the trouble. Before closing the video, I want to commemorate these greatest of all-time processors. These are processors that were wonderful in their time and have a very separate place for me. Now that I've commemorated these processors, we can now end the video. Which of these recommendations do you plan to carry out after this video? Don't forget to leave your plans and experiences here in the comments. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button. If not, feel free to dislike it. Stay mysterious until the next video. Take care, and bye. PCs are complex devices, which is why there are so many myths surrounding them. Sometimes these are total lies, and other times they were once true, but are no longer valid today. In this video, I'm going to talk about exactly these. This way, you'll save both time and money. So let's get started. This concept isn't actually new to the channel. I previously published a video covering different PC myths. If this interests you, you can watch that video after this one. So let's start with our first myth. Myth 1. The image always degrades when switching from high resolution to low resolution. This is both true and false. Monitors have a specific physical number of pixels, and this dictates what the resolution is. When you use a 1080p monitor at 1080p resolution, you get the most natural and sharpest image. However, if you lower a Quad HD monitor to 1080p because your PC's performance isn't enough, the image will degrade seriously. The reason is this: the pixel layout of Quad HD resolution cannot be divided into 1080p by a whole integer ratio. This causes pixels to mismatch, leading to half pixels being carried over, resulting in blurriness and distortion. If you want to lower the resolution on a Quad HD monitor, the most logical option is 1280 by 720. Because this resolution is an exact integer divisor of Quad HD, the pixels match up correctly. Consequently, the image you get is a genuine and clean 720p. But if you experience the same situation on a 4K monitor, you won't suffer image loss, because exactly 2 times of 1080p is 2160p, or 4K resolution. This means the pixels divide perfectly. Along with this myth, I can also say this: if you are using a build with an RTX 3060 and plan to switch to a more powerful graphics card, like an RTX 6070 in the future, it might make sense to lean towards 4K monitors if you want to buy a high-resolution display early. You won't experience serious ugliness using 1080p on a 4K monitor with an RTX 3060, and when you upgrade your graphics card later, you'll be ready for 4K resolution. It might sound like an edge case, but the tech world is full of surprises. If the resolution topic doesn't interest you much, the next myth will catch your attention a lot more. Myth 2. The 1 millisecond label on monitors is real. Except for OLED monitors, this is a big fat no. There is already a detailed guide on the channel about this, but I will summarize the subject briefly and clearly here. 2 different response time measurements are used in monitors: GTG and MPRT. GTG, or gray to gray, is the transition time from one shade of gray to another. This value is generally referred to as the first response time. And the 1 millisecond tag we see in monitor ads usually refers to the GTG value. MPRT, or moving picture response time, is the response time for moving images. As you can guess from the name, it is based on objects moving on the screen and covers all color transitions. That's why the MPRT value always comes out higher compared to GTG. These 2 values are directly linked. If the gap between them widens too much, serious image problems like ghosting occur. This is exactly why there are many 1 millisecond monitors on the market that are infamous for ghosting issues. This is the first reason debunking the myth. The second reason is this: you see constantly changing frames on the screen while gaming. Therefore, in practice, the value that really matters is MPRT. However, ads usually list GTG because it is much more attractive for marketing. If the MPRT value is high, you will experience serious motion clarity problems, especially ghosting. This brings us to the third and strongest proof: the FPS to millisecond relationship. 1 second is 1,000 milliseconds. If you divide 1,000 by your monitor's refresh rate, you find the ideal MPRT value that needs to be reached. For example, for a 165 Hz monitor, the ideal MPRT value is approximately 6.06 milliseconds. However, many monitors on the market cannot fully provide even this value. To obtain a genuine 1 millisecond MPRT, you theoretically need a 1000 Hz monitor. So the 1 millisecond tag you see on the market today practically does not reflect reality most of the time. On the other hand, there is no such mathematical limit for GTG. The ideal is for both GTG and MPRT values to be low and remain close to each other. you cannot learn these values just by reading the box or the spec sheet. For real results, you need to look at reliable sources like Artings that test monitors with specialized equipment. Myth 3. A high hertz monitor is a must-have. There isn't a single clear answer to this. The most important criterion here is your usage scenario. If you are browsing the internet, watching videos, and doing daily simple tasks, even a 75 Hz monitor is more than enough. If you play esports-focused games, things change. In these types of games, you generally get very high FPS values. Therefore, monitors with high refresh rates like 240 Hz, 280 Hz, or even 360 Hz can provide a competitive advantage. However, if you play AAA story-driven games, it is difficult to reach FPS values as high as in esports games. In this scenario, your sole focus shouldn't be the monitor's hertz value. For most users, 165 Hz is sufficient in terms of both fluidity and performance. Another important criterion is resolution. Remember that as resolution increases, the FPS you get will decrease. However, you don't have to be distant toward 4K 144 Hz monitors from the start, because if your hardware is sufficient, they can be a very logical choice. The biggest criterion here is your PC's hardware power. To establish this balance correctly, definitely look at the gaming performance of the graphics card you use at 1080p, Quad HD, and 4K resolutions. This ensures you choose the monitor that fits your needs and prevents you from spending unnecessarily. Myth 4. All OLED screens are the same. No, they are not. There are different types of OLED screens: WOLED, QD-OLED, and Tandem OLED. Each of these panels has advantages and disadvantages compared to one another. WOLED panels have an extra white subpixel layer. Thanks to this, white brightness and general brightness performance are better. QD-OLED panels offer a wider color gamut thanks to the quantum dot layer. They are generally more successful regarding color accuracy, especially text clarity compared to WOLEDs. Tandem OLED is created by stacking two separate OLED panels on top of each other. Theoretically, it offers the best performance, but is also the most expensive OLED type. Here, the choice often depends on your budget. However, according to general and reviews, it can be said that QD OLED panels are more balanced and successful. The characteristic advantages of OLEDs, such as very fast response times, infinite contrast ratios, and pixel-based lighting, are preserved across all these panel types. Another point generally overlooked here is OLED generations. Burn-in problems were experienced much more frequently, especially in first-generation OLED panels. Over time, manufacturers made serious revisions to prevent these kinds of chronic problems and increase panel quality. That's why distinctions like second and third generation emerged. Here, the newer and more modern the OLED panel you choose, the more logical and long-lasting a choice you will have made. I'm cutting it short here since there is a separate video where I explain these topics in detail. If you're interested, you can reach that video from the cards. Now let's leave monitors aside and look at other peripherals. Myth 5. 8,000 Hz on a mouse is very useful. Largely false. For many years, the standard refresh rate for mice was 1,000 Hz. In the last few years, we started seeing values like 4,000 Hz and 8,000 Hz. The logic of Hertz in mice is similar to the refresh rate in monitors. This value represents the number of reports the mouse makes per second. As the Hertz increases, the mouse reports its movements to the PC more frequently. It sounds great on paper, but there are some serious disadvantages to this. First, if you are using an old or weak CPU, 8,000 Hz can cause serious performance losses. FPS drops, micro stutters, and increased system load are the most common examples of this. The second problem is the user factor. 8,000 Hz means much more frequent data transmission. Since this will reflect even the slightest tremor in your hand to the PC, it can increase your margin of error, especially in games requiring stable aiming. Because of this, some users even consciously lower their 8,000 Hz supported mice to 1,000 Hz or 2,000 Hz. Another important point is battery life. As Hertz increases, battery consumption in wireless mice increases seriously. In summary, unless you are playing at a professional esports level, 1,000 Hz will be more than enough for you. Myth 6. Buying high-quality headphones solves everything. If the headphones you chose are high-quality audiophile headphones, the answer is clearly no. In gaming headsets, this situation might rarely be found. Headphones with aux outputs usually work with internal sound chips found on the motherboard, added just to save the day. These chips are often not powerful enough and prevent you from getting full efficiency from the drivers in the headphones. As a result, lower maximum volume, narrower dynamic range, and weak music performance emerge. That's why if you want to use powerful headphones that provide studio quality sound, you need to use a separate DAC or unit alongside them. While these units provide the power the headphones need,
Da ti
they also
treniraju.
offer much cleaner
Da,
and higher
pa
quality sound processing.
noći
If your
treniraju.
headphones aren't at a level that
Kakav
really
je to
needs a
balan?
DAC, the return you get will only be a large expense. On the other hand, some headphones like the SteelSeries Arctis Nova Pro already come with their own DAC units, and a large portion of gaming headsets do not need an external DAC anyways. Myth 7. A reliable brand always makes good
No.
products. A big no. Not just for this video, but for every topic.
Zove
Brands
žena na
have different
telefonu.
product tiers within
Ženo,
themselves,
što mi
and
se
this is the crucial
ne
point
javljaš?
many miss.
Pa
While a brand
trenirala
may be
sam.
very successful
Da.
in its high-end products, the same
Satra se
brand may not
trenirajući.
show the same care in the lower tiers. This gap is sometimes filled by other brands that are less known but do a very good job on specific models. I'll use graphics cards to give a
Satra je
clearer
neki
example.
kolega tamo.
For instance, Gigabyte WindForce models are generally not very successful. In contrast, models like the Inno3D Twin X2 might be a more logical choice in the same segment.
Ovo su već realne
Apart from
misije.
this,
Kaže,
brands can make
da ne si
serious
najmanje
mistakes from time to
kritično
time.
pogotka u toj
One of the
jednoj
most obvious
bitci,
examples of this was the
ošteti najmanje
RTX
3 neprijateljska
3060 Ti
vozila
and RTX 3070 Ti models using
i dobro junički jedan
GDDR6X
neprijateljski
memory
tim
in
koji
the
ima duh.
RTX 30 series.
Pa ja.
In these cards
Uništi
using
ga.
GDDR6X VRAM, memory temperatures were reaching truly absurd levels.
To je to,
Manufacturers
znači.
were caught unprepared for this situation,
Nice.
and the cooling solutions used remained insufficient.
Ja da se
Another
prije
important
bacim na
issue is the
EU1, da
generation
završim
difference.
to.
For example,
Pa ćemo
while
vidjeti.
Galaxy models were quite successful in the RTX 40 series,
Sad ćemo.
they couldn't maintain the same level of success in the RTX 50 series. Therefore, when shopping, focus on the model and how successful it is, not the brand. Now let's look inside the PC case with the last 3 points. Myth 8. The 80+ certificate is an indicator of quality. Wrong. Although the truth is told in many places, this is unfortunately a mistake that is still persistently repeated. The 80+ certificate indicates how efficiently a power supply, PSU, uses the electricity it draws from the socket. It does not directly measure quality. Let me explain this with a simple example. Imagine a build consuming 1,000 watts. Both PCs have a 1,000 watt PSU. One has an 80+ white and the other has an 80+ titanium certificate. In this case, while the white certified PSU draws approximately 1,220 watts from the socket, the titanium certified PSU will draw approximately 1,065 watts. So the difference is entirely about electrical efficiency. If you have render projects that take days or use a workstation where many PCs are running, this difference can seriously relieve your electricity bill at the end of the month. But of course, this is also a fact. To reach upper levels in the 80+ certification, the internal component quality of the PSU must also be at a certain level. However, products with fake 80+ certificates or certificates that do not reflect reality exist in the market. Therefore, 80+ alone is not a reliable quality benchmark. If you are suspicious of a PSU, you can check whether the relevant model is truly certified via cybernetics. Myth 9. VRMs on motherboards are very important. VRMs are important up to a point, but for most users, they're not as critical as they are claimed to be. The basic duty of the VRMs, or voltage regulator modules on the motherboard, is to transmit the power the processor needs to the CPU in a stable manner. So, the main determining factor here is the processor you use. Today, many processors between the mid to high tier can work without issues with the VRM structure of most motherboards. The point where VRMs really gain more importance is with top-tier processors. But there is no need to exaggerate even there. In a PC running at stock settings, reasonable VRMs are more than enough.
Ja,
If
znači
you're
sad
dealing with
trakovo da
overclocking,
da
that's when
mogu.
VRM quality gains much more meaning. So let's talk a bit about this topic. Myth 10. Overclocking and undervolting make a serious difference. For overclocking, mostly no. For undervolting, yes. I prepared a detailed guide on this subject recently, and if you want to have deeper knowledge on this, you can watch it after this video ends. Here, I will just quickly summarize the main points. Nowadays, overclocking is not worth the time and money spent for most users. Stability issues, in particular, can appear at a moment you never expect and in a scenario you never anticipated. Undervolting requires a trial and error process just like overclocking. However, unlike overclocking, the probability of getting a return on your effort is much higher. There are many users who both obtain an FPS increase and seriously lower temperatures thanks to this. And with that, we wrap up this video. If you learned something new today, don't hesitate to share it in the comments. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button. If not, feel free to dislike it. Stay mysterious until the next video. Take care, and bye.
Da ti meni reci, kako 2 puta pogodiš istu tačku i rikošet prvi put?
prođe, drugi put rikošet.
Out of all the PC
Joj,
these
znači,
three have the
Bože.
most misinformation: processor, graphics card, and motherboard. In this video, I'll focus on correcting the common myths about these three. If this video gets
Ubiga.
enough likes, I'll dive into other PC components and debunk more myths in a series. So, if you have your notepad ready, let's get started. Myth 1. Air cooling became outdated and is bad at cooling. Liquid cooling is better. Answer. Certainly wrong. This is probably one of the most widespread myths about PC components. Liquid coolers aren't always the most effective cooling.
Samo lagano opušteno.
Jesi za jedan crnjak, brati, onako
Crnjak?
žešći.
Jesam, ja volim crnjake.
Čuli ljudi da ima, da ispod mosta sve lekovita voda. Da leči sve. I ništa, tako krenuši ljudi da dolaze. Uđe jedan čovjek bez ruke, izađe sa novom rukom.
Aha.
Kad je to vidio, dođe čovjek sa štakama, bez noge, baci štake, uđe u vodu, izraste mu nova noga. Dođe čovjek bez oka, uđe u vodu, ima nazad oko. Dođe majka s smrtnim detetom, uđe, dete oživi. Dođe čovjek u invalidskim kolicima, uđe u vodu, a izađe iz vode sa novim kolicima.
Ljebe, dragi. I, hajde dalje.
Ništa nema dalje, vrati.
Znači, Bože.
Uđe sa kolicima, izađe s novim. Ojevim.
Znači, Bože.
For you to be able to understand why not, I need to tell you about the quality of silicon used in processors. You can think of the silicon like a tray. When processors are being manufactured, this tray gets split into multiple parts, and processors will be made using these parts. The middle part of this tray is better in quality. Because of this, if your processor's silicon was taken from the middle part,
Izbaci, zatvori on meni tenkove, jel, zatvori meni tenkove, pa više neću ni uđi.
Ba.
This way you can make more extreme adjustments when overclocking and undervolting. You might think of it like this. For example, if your processor has high quality silicon at a certain voltage, you can get speeds up to 5.3 gigahertz. If it has bad quality silicon with the same voltage, you might only get
Gonzalo
as
sa
high as
fugasnom je isto,
5.2 gigahertz.
znači
So you need to adjust your settings by trial and error without taking
ekstra
any
i ovaj
risks.
TS54
Though
je
for an
dobar.
average user who wouldn't overclock or
Ljebe,
undervolt,
dragi,
the
hoćemo li ga
silicon quality doesn't mean much.
kamen
The
pogoditi?
processor will go up to the specified speeds regardless. Myth 4. A powerful processor and a weak graphics card cannot be used together. For you to understand it better, let's change it up to this. An RTX 4060 and an i7 14700KF cannot be used together. Answer: both true and false. If you're building the PC solely for gaming, this wouldn't be an ideal decision, but it can still be used. As the processor would support the graphics card well, you can get the maximum performance from the graphics card while
Prvu
gaming.
bitku, onu
In fact, if the
azijsku
only games
mapu,
you play are
pa
competitive games in
rudnik,
low
pa
resolution, this can
pustinja,
make a
pa
bit more sense.
stepe, pa
As the
onda
game resolution
4
decreases,
puta
the
pustinja, pa
processors
2 put
utilize more.
stepe, pa
So
opet
this can be a
rudnik i
sensible
opet
decision
ovo.
for Valorant and
Jebim.
CS2 players who prefer lower resolutions. But considering that most people don't exclusively play these games as mentioned, this would be a nonsensical decision. Additionally, there are some programs that, like the need for processor performance, also require graphics card performance to support the processor. Because of this, it always makes more sense to buy PC components that are balanced and that can support each other well. For this, you can use websites that calculate bottlenecks. Myth 5. As the resolution increases, the processor usage will rise. Answer: wrong. I've mentioned this in myth 2. As the resolution increases, the graphics card usage will rise, not the processor usage. Thanks to this, the processor can support the graphics card better. For example, the Ryzen 5 5600 with the 4070 Ti can get bottlenecked when you try to play games in 1080p resolution. But when the resolution is raised to 1440p, as some of the load shifts to the graphics card, the processor can support it better. This way, the bottleneck can be reduced. By the way, let me share a little piece of information with you. You can see that some gaming tests performed on newly released processors are being made in 720p or 1080p resolutions. Of course, this isn't because the reviewer only has a 720p monitor. These tests are being done this way because more strain is put on the processor as the resolution decreases. This way, the performance of the processor can be tested better. Myth 6. The more expensive processor will always perform better. Answer: wrong. This completely depends on the usage case for the processor. Some programs can perform differently between Intel and AMD processors due to the way they work or due to the processor architecture. You must know this. Besides this, something else that you must know is that processors are better in some areas than other areas. For example, most Ryzen processors with X3D in their names perform really good in games due to the cache advantage, but they cannot perform as well in other use cases such as 3D rendering. In this case, you must find the most efficient processor for your use case. Besides this, there can be vast differences in temperatures of processors with similar performance. For example, the R5 7600X and R5 7600 show similar performance, but the 7600X tends to get hotter. To add to this, the Ryzen X3D processors are pretty good when it comes to temperatures too, despite also having great gaming performance. Myth 7. Graphics cards from brands like MSI and Asus perform better. Answer: false. Brands take the GPU from manufacturers like Nvidia and AMD, then sell it after customizing stuff such as the card's cooling. Due to this, the GPU is the same across all RTX 4060 cards. There can be differences between the graphics cards of brands like Asus and MSI in terms of cooling performance, design,
Tako i treba, znači Type 64 gdje si ti došao tu da se nabiješ?
Listing them all like this might have worried you a little, but the brand is not that important. Unless the card you're planning to buy has any widespread issues or is from a no-name brand, you won't have any issues. Just don't unnecessarily spend more money. A card like the RTX 4060 doesn't really run hot anyways. You don't need to go with an expensive card with special cooling. I have tier list videos about this. If you're interested, you can find it on my channel. Myth 8. Bottlenecks harm PC components. Answer: wrong. In forums and YouTube videos, it said that bottlenecks harm PC components. In contrary to what's said, you don't need to worry. Bottlenecks do not cause damage on the components. And especially if the bottleneck amount is around 5 to 10%, it's hardly noticeable to begin with. If the bottleneck amount is 15% or higher, you might get upset as you couldn't get your money's worth on the graphics card. But besides this, there is nothing to be worried about. Myth 9. The most popular graphics card is the best. Answer: both true and false. As the best-selling graphics card manufacturer today is Nvidia, things get a bit complicated. I need to explain this in a bit more detail. While some graphics cards have good performance in gaming, some may have more performance in other use cases, such as video editing. Nvidia cards give better performance compared to its competitors in areas of video editing and artificial intelligence, thanks to CUDA and TensorRT. Of course, the performance is better, but the price can be higher than its competitors too. On the other hand, in terms of raw performance, AMD graphics cards have better performance compared to their competitors, meaning it provides a good hardware performance without features like DLSS and FrameJet. This makes AMD graphics cards the better option for games like Valorant and CS2, which don't support DLSS. Also, in some countries, AMD graphics cards are really cheap compared to Nvidia graphics cards. Due to this, you must pick your graphics card for your specific use case instead of just picking the most popular option. Actually, it might be a good idea to make a separate video about this.
Baš ljebe, dragi, žuto nije probilo.
Are two different things. Answer: true. These two terms get mixed up often, so I wanted to explain this. VRM is the circuit that relays the power that the processor needs to the processor. The higher phase and ampere rating the circuit has, the more stable and complete it can deliver the required power. If the processor doesn't receive the required power, there will be losses in performance. Similarly, this is important for overclocking enthusiasts too. This isn't important in entry to middle-tier motherboards, but having a good VRM lets the PC run more stable in the future when you decide to upgrade your processor. On the other hand, VRAM is a special kind of memory graphics cards use. The amount of VRAM is important for gaming and fast data processing in professional applications. And as mentioned in the previous myth, you need enough VRAM to play games smoothly in higher resolutions and higher graphics settings. Myth 11. The PCI Express version of the motherboard isn't very important. Answer: both true and false. It's really hard for me to explain this without explaining what PCI Express is. You can think of PCI Express as a highway that connects the graphics cards and SSDs to the PC.
Ajde još jednom,
The
ajde,
wider
ajde,
this highway,
izađi.
the more data can be transferred, while the PCI Express version indicates the baseline speeds. Terms like X8 and X16 refer to the number of lanes. For example, let's say a graphics card works as expected in the PCI Express 4.0 X8 lane. If you were to plug this graphics card into a PCI Express 3.0 X8 slot, you may experience a decrease in performance. Also, the PCI Express version doesn't prevent you from plugging in and using a component, but it might limit the component from reaching its full potential. We experience this the most in M.2 SSDs. For example, let's say you bought an SSD that can go up to 5 gigabytes per second. If you plug this SSD into a PCI Express 3.0 motherboard, your speed may be capped out as low as 3.5 gigabytes per second. On the contrary, if you plug a PCI Express 3.0 SSD into a PCI Express 4.0 motherboard, you will get the maximum speeds the SSD can offer, but you won't gain any additional performance. If this speed cap isn't an issue for you, the PCI Express version may not be all that important to you. Myth 12. I should definitely avoid dead sockets. Answer, both true and false. The term dead socket refers to a CPU socket that will no longer support new processors. If you want to use your PC for a long time, you should avoid dead sockets. For example, someone who bought an AM5 motherboard can upgrade from the Ryzen 7000 series to the 9000 series in the future, meaning that they can upgrade their PC. But if you're on a tight budget, I still think that motherboards with LGA 1700 and AM4 sockets can still be worth buying. As their performances are still enough, they won't create any issues in the short run. Just know that there will no longer be any new processors for these sockets.
15.5, Lakeville, joj jesam nad, ujebem ti sunce, 3700 u sedmici, 3700, da li je to high kaliber ili nije high kaliber? Znači, na vlaku što sam napravio dobru. Bože. Da vidimo da li smo završili referala ili nismo završili referala. Jesmo, završili smo referala sa 50 fucking poena u jednoj partiji. Contract completed.
Because of this, you should check the motherboard's features and if it fits your needs. All right, let's finish the video slowly. If you like the video, don't forget to hit the like button. If not, feel free to dislike. Stay mysterious until the next video. Take care, and bye. Today's video is going to be a follow-up on our basic guides on laptops and desktops. However, this time the topics that we are going to detail will be more in-depth. Therefore, if you are not interested in computers, the topics we're going to discuss may be a bit confusing to you. So I'd recommend at least checking your own PC to have a basic understanding before watching this video. By the way, if you like this video, I'll share the second part next week. So if you are ready, let's get started. Let's start with CPU namings because they determine if a PC is power or efficiency focused. What do the letters at the end of CPUs mean? For Intel desktop processors, the Intel naming convention consists of 4 elements: brand, model, generation, and TDP values. Firstly, you have the brand. Intel